What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Sandland, an open-world action-adventure set in the desolate Sandland, as the name might imply, where water is one of the most valuable resources around. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video discussing everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. And with that said, let's actually dive into this one. So, Sandland is in fact based on a manga by Akira Toriyama of the same name, but where that series ends, this particular game tries to take up the mantle and expand upon the ideas a bit, while also taking the story a bit farther, introducing a new area, characters, and more. More to the point though, this is a game that sees us roaming around the open world with all sorts of vehicles that serve as both our mode of transportation and one of the primary forms of combat in the game. We'll be battling quite a bit with all of these different vehicles available to us with 13 distinct types. In addition to that, there's a little bit of exploration and side content to get up to, so Sandland is trying to do a fair few things, I would say. But pretty much as always, let's open this up by talking about the technical state of this particular title, and I'm happy to report here that I personally didn't really have any issues, and with this game being released a few days back on the 25th of April, it doesn't seem like there are too many complaints of other technical problems either. Really, the only thing I could find is that some people experience a fair amount of stuttering with the title, but even I didn't run into that myself. And while there are never any complete guarantees that you won't run into some extreme fringe case, for the most part, this game seems to be doing very well on a technical level, which was a bit surprising to me because I normally have a little more to talk about in this section, but there really just wasn't much going on there. They even got the PC controls right, letting you customize to your heart's content, which in my experience has been a little hit or miss for Bandai. Next up, let's talk about the difficulty of this particular game. So, difficulty-wise, there are a few options for this game, but I want to stress that this game is very easy overall, and isn't likely to pose a significant challenge to you unless you're going out of your way to be in places you probably shouldn't be. Now, your options, though, are easy, normal, or hard, and best I can tell, messing around with this scales exactly how much damage enemies will do, but doesn't seem to affect too much else, but they don't give us a lot of info on this either, so I'm not 100% sure how much this is actually affecting. But I do know that, as said, not a difficult game in a lot of ways. The combat outside of vehicles is just very button mashy, and even on hard, I really wouldn't expect that much of a challenge overall. Which brings us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, a significant portion of this particular game follows the overall plot of the main series, and then goes a bit farther and expands upon that afterwards in a new area of the game. And because of that, if you don't want spoilers for this, you might just want to go ahead and skip past this particular section altogether, because it's very hard to talk about this game without spoiling something, even with contextual footage in the background of the review. So you've been warned in that regard. Otherwise, let's go ahead and talk about it. Sandland takes place in the country of Sandland, which, as the name most certainly implies, is a vast desert where water is extremely scarce. Now, the reason the area is like this is down to human folly, with humans having fought wars until there was basically nothing left, and in the aftermath of this, the king manages to supply water to the kingdom at exorbitant rates, thus igniting our reason for adventure. We play the role of Beelzebub, the fiend prince of demons themselves being known for their mischief, really. After a few tasks around Demon Village, another main character, Sheriff Rao, arrives to explain that he's searching for a legendary spring and water source to share with the people and make everybody's lives better. He convinces the demons to help him out, and thus our character, Beelzebub, is sent alongside his right-hand man, Thief, to help out with this search and try to make that happen. This gets off to a decent start before your vehicle is ultimately destroyed, forcing you to steal a nearby tank from an army base. You then take this tank, which becomes your main vehicle throughout the entirety of the story, but you will have others, to fight off various combatants while you search for this water source, and that comprises the bulk of the story. But, as I mentioned, this goes a bit farther than the main series ever did. After that series ends is where the rest of the game picks up, or the second half of this one, where we make our way to a new land known as Forest Land. And while I don't want to spoil what goes on here, even outside the context of this review, it introduces more story that wasn't present in the mainline series and expands upon and even introduces new characters. But throughout the story, one of the main themes is that the demons are very misunderstood, often seen by humans for exactly what demons are in real life, but the reality of what they are and what they get up to has very little in common with that colorful depiction, let's say. In fact, if anything, demons are surprisingly helpful in a lot of cases, with really only their king, Lucifer himself, being capable of anything approaching actual evil, but even he seems pretty disinterested in the pursuit. And at least to my mind, some of the story is about examining the ways in which really humans are to blame for everything wrong with Sandland, and that despite their superstitions, demons and outsiders have very little to do with it. And overall, I would say it's a solid enough plot for what the game aims to be. Now, there are moments where the telling of that story can be a little awkward and can feel a little too much like you're watching a show, for instance, with characters jumping around or doing things that don't make a ton of sense continuity-wise. That is to say, you walk up to an area with a cutscene in one of your vehicles, but then the cutscene plays and you're suddenly out of that vehicle, it's nowhere to be seen, fighting someone, and then the game switches back to gameplay and suddenly you're both in vehicles again, and just little things like that that can feel a little awkward in the execution. But otherwise, I thought it was a decent enough plot for what the game is trying to be, even if it feels a little bit silly at times. And what's more, though, is that over the course of the game, you're going to be meeting all sorts of characters, impacting their lives very substantially, and in that way I think the story succeeds at what it was trying to do. And it definitely had its good moments on top of that. So while I don't think this story of this game is going to be absolutely incredible or super memorable to everyone, I do think it's decent for what it is. Which brings us to the progression systems of the game, which comes down to leveling up your vehicles and upgrading and managing the town of Spino. Now, technically speaking, we do gain experience as we fight and kill things out in the open world, but the experience gain for that is extremely small. Most of your level ups and experience gain is going to come from questing, but when you level up, you'll be granted skill points for both you and your side characters that are with you, and you'll be able to spend these on skills. Now, for the most part, these skills affect on-foot combat, but as I've already mentioned, a lot of that combat is very button-mashy anyway, so I did find a lot of these skill upgrades to be very unimpactful in terms of actual gameplay, since a lot of the best skill activations you even unlock come from the main story anyways. So there's that. Now, your companions do have a handful of passive abilities that will help you out, and even one or two active ones that are nice. For instance, Thief has a radar that you can activate to find things. Rao himself actually gets a very useful support ability that drops him into a tank as well to help you out in vehicle combat, and little things like that. So not completely useless, but not exactly game-changing either, and a relatively simple bit of progression outside of the passive stat level-ups anyway. Now, a much bigger form of progression is your vehicles. In addition to the tank, which is necessary for the main story, there are 12 other types of vehicles that you can eventually make and then customize to your heart's content. Each of these is upgradable as well alongside their weapons. Now, the vehicles themselves will have a base level that you can upgrade, which provides passive stat bonuses to them, and also allows them to equip better and better equipment in the form of parts. These parts have rarity tiers associated with them, and forms a bulk of in-game progression. Now, one thing I didn't like in that regard is that the best stuff starts dropping at the very end of the game when there's quite frankly not that much left to do. So vehicle customization throughout most of the story is very basic, but then at the end they're suddenly like, hey, here's a bunch of extra tiers of vehicle parts that not only can you upgrade, you can also very specifically adjust the stat modifiers to which you would like to upgrade, which isn't the case until you get to that point. And I do wish they had introduced that mechanic earlier. And what's more, for your weapons in particular, you can upgrade those to do more damage and be more useful as well. And you might consider not doing this at first just because you're going to get better equipment anyway, But crafting a lot of the better weapons requires max level versions of earlier weapons once you get towards the end game again. So that's also a way they tried to incorporate some of that upgrading material. And you combine that with the ability to paint and customize each one of these vehicles alongside just the various ways and weapons you can attach to them and how they operate and handle. There's a lot going on in terms of vehicle customization that, as a progression system, is really the highlight of what this game has to offer. Though, I will say, a lot of that customization is locked behind ever-increasing need for various types of materials, because you will have to craft some of this stuff yourself, either from a workshop who can combine materials to make what you need, or simply making the actual parts of the vehicles from your garage in Spino. And it can get a little tedious, especially when you're trying to manage up to 13 different vehicles that all require an egregious amount of parts to keep up with. So it can be a bit of a headache juggling all of that at times. That brings me to another big part of progression, though, which is the town of Spino. Little more than a hole in the ground when you find it, but the reason for going there is that it has basically the only functional garage you'll actually be able to use to upgrade your vehicles and thus do what you need it to do so you can chase down the legendary spring. This brings you into contact with the town mayor, who explains that this used to be an army base for the resistance some decades ago before it was destroyed by the king's army. You agree to fix the place up simply because it's beneficial for you to do so, and this forms the bulk of the game's side content. You can go around to various individuals who will have side quests for you, which usually results in them returning to Spino in some way to help you fill out the town and take it from essentially a single building when you arrive to a full-blown little city by the time you leave. And I was genuinely impressed with how much went into building up Spino, though you don't really have a lot of direct control over the things that are happening. Basically, you'll do these side quests and then that will unlock something in town, but you're not yourself directing the construction or anything. However, this does result in Spino becoming by far the best hub in the game and your main hub with every conceivable shop and interaction point you would want, which includes things like a workshop to craft materials for your vehicles, the paint shop, the other customization parts for your vehicles, etc., and even more useful things like, for instance, a quest turn-in vendor for the bounties you can take on, and other things like that. So don't neglect your main hub, is what I'm saying. Now that's pretty much what there is to know progression-wise, so let's talk about the gameplay and world now. So in some ways, I would say the open world of Sandland is very traditional, but I do think it has its good moments and its bad moments, really. Now, on the traditional side of things, throughout the landscape, you can find radio towers that you'll be able to repair to then reveal the area around said radio tower to show you fast travel points, supply points, things like that. Now, as this is a desert that is desperate for water, a lot of your supply and camp points are simply places you can refill your water. These act as fast travel points alongside towns, and you can even find campsites where you can cycle the day and night. In addition to that basic setup, however, we also have things like towns, vendors, and quests. You'll find quite a few different towns scattered throughout the land, which is usually where you'll find your vendors and quests at. Vendors are useful for a variety of reasons, not least of which because they can sell you consumable items that you might need, such as health for you or your vehicle, but it's also usually where you'll find blueprints as well. Blueprints are what are going to give you the crafting schematics for certain types of vehicles to let you make new parts, and in some cases you might even find frames. In order to build a new vehicle, you first have to find a frame, and then be able to build the parts to actually craft it. So you'll find a lot of that via the vendors out in the world, and then there's the side quests themselves, which are mostly self-explanatory, I would say, as I've already talked about with Spino, and the quality of those side quests is pretty good, and I would say talks a bit about the world building and what went into this world and why it is the way it is, and perhaps unsurprisingly, dealing with some of the struggles therein. But now let's talk a little more specifically about individual portions. So one thing I didn't like too much about this particular game is that there are effectively two types of dungeons. There are ruins you can find out in the world where you can find coins that you can turn back in Spino to get some kind of reward, usually blueprints, etc. And those are very stock standard. In fact, if you explore a lot of them, you'll see a lot of asset reuse in those ruins. And then the other type of dungeon is basically the interior of some fallen battleship that you see repeated a lot, and technically there's a few different Fallen battleships, but the interior all looks pretty much the same, and it gets a little tiresome to run through these after a while. But run through them we shall, and while we do that, we're going to be picking up all sorts of items and things that drop off of enemies. Now, a lot of what you need for crafting until you get to the late game is going to be acquired through enemies. Eventually, you'll upgrade Spino and thus other vendors to a point where you can simply buy a lot of the base materials for your vehicles, but there is a lot of very specific stuff that you'll need to kill specific types of enemies to get your hands on that you can then craft into the usable materials to then use on your vehicle, which can be a little tedious at times as well, just because of the sheer volume of items you'll typically need. Speaking of your vehicles though, while there are 13 different types available to you, you're only going to have 5 with you at one time. Early on in the game, it introduces capsule technology, which shrinks your vehicles down to the size of nothing, which is how you're carrying them around, but you can only do this with up to 5 of them, which you can set either in Spino or somewhere else that will allow you to do it, such as various vendors here and there at, say, racing places. And then you can hotkey quickly into whichever vehicle you would prefer. It's important to know which vehicles you're carrying around with you though, because they are also utilized via traversal. As you might imagine, a lot of this land and area, even the inside of dungeons, is only traversable with certain vehicles. You'll get a few different types. Jump and hover are probably the most notable for this, with car-oriented vehicles just being for speed, really. But jump bots do exactly what the name would suggest. They're going to allow you to jump much higher than you could normally to get up the various sheer cliffs you'll find around Sandland and Forestland. And then there's the hover. Eventually you'll start seeing more water, and that's where the hover vehicles come in. They're going to get you over the surface of that water because otherwise you cannot swim. So it's important to know that not only do vehicles form a role in combat, but also traversal. And then there is the content of said open world. Now this is where things get a little bit dicey because outside of what I've mentioned previously, there's really not that much to get up to. But we can find various race courses throughout that will require you to have a certain type of vehicle, and then you can participate in these races for extra rewards, usually things to help customize and continue to advance your vehicles. And much later on, you can also find a battle arena, which will let you take part in various staged battles via on foot or in your vehicle, to also earn extra rewards for your vehicle customization. Personally, I don't think the on-foot combat was really good enough to justify that, but the battles against various other types of vehicles and you can be fun, especially the challenge rounds, which pit you in very specific situations with a very specific vehicle that you have to work your way out of, and I thought that was a bit fun. Another thing you can do out there is take on repeatable bounties. Certain vendors throughout the world will point you towards bounties of individual characters, usually in the form of gang bosses, that type of thing, or just general hooligans, causing issues, and you can take them out for a reward if that is of interest to you. And in fact, that is a great way to get your hands on some of the frames for the more advanced types of vehicles in the late game, so something to keep in mind for sure. Now that's the vast majority of what you're going to be doing, and truth be told, I think it's a little bland most of the time, but it isn't the only thing out there, because there is actually some hidden stuff the game doesn't really tell you too much about. For instance, a lot of the characters you're running into are named, they're actual people you can talk to, and in doing so, you might find little unmarked quests that add a little more flavor to things going on. And to that exact end, you can also find various lost items throughout the game, and then through a bit of trial and error, return them to their original owners, which can also give you a little bit of extra information about the world. And nothing outside of you just finding it and taking it upon yourself to do that ever really leads you to those things, which I thought was a fun bit of added flavor to these things. Now, all in all, for the gameplay and world of Sandland, I will say that it does definitely feel like somebody cared here. They put a lot of effort into the characterization of the people and the places, but otherwise the content of a lot of these areas can fall a little flat, and I just wish there was a bigger variety with bigger impact on you, as there just doesn't feel like a lot of a good reason to simply go and explore any given area, especially given the asset reuse that we see in play with things like the ruins and whatnot. So it's got its good and its bad moments. That brings me to combat, however. Combat for this game is interesting because it's divided up into two parts, the on-foot combat and the vehicle combat. In both instances, I would say it's very button-mashy, but there's certainly a few things to know. Now, on foot, you're going to be capable of dodging out of the way and activating abilities. Now, in order to activate abilities, you have to power up your darkness for Beelzebub to utilize his fiendish powers. There are 5 of these. They have different requirements in terms of how much darkness you need to use them, and then you can also activate your allies' abilities this way outside of their passives. So that's really all there is to know about on-foot combat. Very straightforward, very easy system. Now, vehicles are a bit more complicated just because of the customization available, but also aren't particularly outrageous or anything in what they're attempting to do. So first, we start with the actual vehicle you're driving. They all handle and perform differently due to the types of weapons and parts they can have equipped. For instance, things like a bike or your car will only ever shoot forward, and thus positioning is incredibly important, whereas things like the tank, etc., can spin around 360 with the camera and attack in multiple directions simply based on where you're looking. Another big part of vehicle combat is, of course, which weapons you have attached, some of which is limited, of course, by the vehicle we are using once again, but each vehicle also comes with a primary and secondary weapon system, but you don't have to worry about things like ammo and whatnot. Once you reach 0, it will start to recharge upon your next use or when you switch to your alternative weapon. And understanding how these weapons play and work for each individual type of vehicle you have in use is important, as they'll have things like different ranges. The vehicle itself will have different defense, speed, and attack power options, and utilizing the right vehicle at the right time is a big part of this. And in combination with simply customizing your vehicle, destroying stuff with these, especially the tank in my case, was a lot of fun, and it's likely where the bulk of the gameplay is to be had in this particular title, so liking this is really make or break. Now, outside of everything I've just mentioned, there are also a lot of bosses which are designed to be fought in vehicles. These are typically your much larger bosses, and while you can get out on foot during these fights, obviously that's not a particularly good idea. And because of that, they do occasionally lean into certain mechanics that you can then replay in the battle arena if you enjoyed them well enough, and there's a fair few interesting boss fights that can keep you on your toes a little bit, but again, not a terribly difficult game. For me, though, the real highlight of this game was building, tinkering, and customizing around with what later on becomes an eventual rolling death machine, taking out everything, animal, enemy forces, etc., over the course of the game, and that leads a nice progression feel into these things. And it's definitely where I was having the most fun. With that out of the way, let's talk about Steam Deck, positives, negatives, and then wrap this up. So, Steam Deck, happy to report, runs extremely well on the Steam Deck. In fact, there's really not much else to say about that. It's got cloud saves, it's got controller support, it runs pretty fantastic just straight out of the box, getting like 40 to 50 FPS. In fact, I've seen a lot of people saying it runs much better for them on Steam Deck than it does their PC due to the stuttering and shader compilation stuff. So not only is Steam Deck a great way to play this, for a lot of people it might actually be the preferred way to play this particular title. Which brings me to my positives and negatives. So the positives for me were the vehicles themselves and then all the side quests around Spino. As I just mentioned, I loved upgrading, customizing, and then utilizing the various vehicles in combat, as that really was a joy to mess around with. Another side is Spino. It was very cool how far they took that. I expected to effectively build a small town out of this little hole in the ground that we find, and it turns out that you build it into this really big city. And getting to know some of the residents of that city through its quests and running through all those was a really good time, surprisingly. And while you don't control the nitty-gritty of certain aspects of that development, it was really fun to see that progress over the course of the game and your interactions with those characters at the same time. I enjoyed that a lot more than I thought I was going to, and I wanted to call it out here. Now, on the negative side of things, for starters, I would say the on-foot combat is very underwhelming. Not much going on there at all, just a couple of abilities you'll activate, otherwise you just spam the attack button on every single difficulty, and it's pretty underwhelming. Another side of that is the exploration side of things. There's simply too much asset reuse in a lot of these ruins and places out in the world, and because of that and the fact that once you've learned what's in any individual place, there's very little reason to go out and simply explore this desolate wasteland. And that's not a huge surprise because it's a desolate wasteland, and deserts as a whole are notoriously difficult to give you interesting things to do and see, while also still feeling like a desert in a video game. Which leads to you feeling like there's really not much of a point in simply picking a direction and exploring, because all of the content is largely centered around individual towns, and if you do need to go somewhere out in the actual wild area, areas of the map, chances are you're going to a very specific place for a very specific reason, and you already know exactly what you need from that place, and doing much more than that simply isn't necessary or worth your time, really. And because of that, I think exploration could have definitely used a lot of love, and that is going to bring us to our conclusion. So, Sandland is a mostly fun action-adventure that definitely has a few weak moments. By and large, though, it was a very enjoyable experience. In total, I wound up getting about 40 hours out of it, with the main story taking me about 25. And for that experience I've just covered, you can expect to pay $60 US and whatever that amounts to regionally for people. And my initial reaction to that was simply that it is, frankly, a little bit on the expensive side. And I did, in fact, pay for this game. I did not get a review copy for this. And if I was buying this purely for myself, I don't think it would have quite justified that price tag, but otherwise would have been fun. Now the thing is, I did not entirely buy this for myself, as I've saved it for this part of the review, but Sandland, it must be said, has a certain childlike quality to quite a bit of it, both in terms of your main character, his general level of maturity, etc. And thus, I assumed, both from this and the over-the-top vehicle combat, that my young 5-year-old son would very much so likely enjoy it, which was absolutely the case. He sat with me and helped me fight multiple bosses, was very, very impressed by all the vehicles, so he was quite happy to blow up the big bad guys. And that experience was worth the price I paid for it for myself, at the very least. So, while I could certainly see this being a buy on sale for a lot of people, if only due to the price tag, I had a lot of fun with it on my own. I also got to spend time and enjoy it with my son as well, which means it would very likely be a great game to buy for younger children, or something to play with them perhaps, and for that alone, it was worth it to me. So I'm going to give it a buy. I feel like I more than got my $60 out of it, if you understand everything we just went over. And that is where we're going to call this one a review. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something about the game, found it informative. Do let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.